The sound reached them first, a steady growl rolling up the valley, gathering teeth. Heads turned in the market square of Guernica as vendors tugged at canvas covers and mothers pulled children close. A few men shaded their eyes and searched the pale sky. For a heartbeat, everything held: the talk, the hooves, the smell of fruit and pens, and then the shapes appeared, dark against the light, flying low in tight formation. The growl became a roar. The first bombs hit the plaza. Stone and glass lifted, bodies were thrown, and a gray wall of dust folded over the stalls. People ran for doorways that were no longer standing. It was Monday, April 26, 1937, market day in the Basque town of Guernica. Spain's civil war had been raging for nearly a year, splitting the country between the elected Republican government and the nationalist uprising led by General Francisco Franco. Guernica sat on the road toward Bilbao and near the bridge over the Oca River at Renteria. It was also the ceremonial heart of the Basque country, the site of the Casa de Juntas and the Old Oak, where leaders swore to respect Basque liberties. To bomb it was to hit a people's identity while choking a supply route. The attackers were Germany's Condor Legion and their Italian allies, flying Heinkel and Junkers bombers with escorts. Their plan stacked effects: break roofs with explosives, ignite what was exposed with incendiaries, and strafe the roads and fields where people might flee. In late afternoon, the first wave dropped heavy ordnance across the center of town. Roof beams snapped and timber burst into splinters. Survivors staggered through smoke and turned toward the countryside. Engines rose again. Fighters swept in low and fired on bridges, crossroads, and groups of people, driving them back. A second wave followed, then another, carrying incendiary canisters that spilled fire across attics and courtyards. Wind fed the flames. Water mains were broken. Streets jammed with rubble, carts, and animals torn loose from their pens. Inside homes, families crouched in cellars while dust and heat pressed down from above. In the church, candles guttered as the air shook. Teachers gathered children in stairwells, counting heads as the sound made numbers slip. The bombing ran for hours with pauses that felt like the end and then weren't. When a lull finally stretched long enough, people crept outside into a light that looked strange, because smoke had turned the afternoon into evening. The city was split open. Whole blocks were down to foundations. A horse lay in a doorway with its tack still on. A handcart burned in the middle of a street with no edges. Fire brigades tried to move hoses through fallen brick and snagged lines on twisted rails. The power failed, and the town fought fire in the dark. On the riverbank, families rinsed ash from faces in water glowing orange from the flames. Reporters reached Guernica as night fell. George Steer of the Times and other correspondents walked the ruins with flashlights and notebooks. They found bomb casings marked with German codes and interviewed residents who described the patterns of the attacks, the opening explosives, the rain of firebombs, and the fighters that raked roads and fields. Their dispatches ran worldwide the next day. Nationalist radio claimed the town had been burned by retreating Republicans. The evidence on the ground said otherwise. Guernica had been made a target on purpose. Counting the dead was wrenching and imprecise. The attack struck on a crowded market day. Families were scattered and records burned. Early reports climbed above 1,000. Later research, drawing on parish rolls and hospital logs, settled in the hundreds, with hundreds more wounded. The numbers shift from source to source, but one fact holds. Most of the town's buildings were destroyed or badly damaged, about 70%, and the people who died that day were overwhelmingly civilians. There was no large barracks, no factory complex whose loss explained the scale of the raid. Militarily, the strike taught a lesson its authors meant to teach. The Condor Legion treated the town as a test for a doctrine that would define the next war. Bombs fell not simply to wreck a bridge or rail yard, but to break a community's ability to function, killing, burning, isolating, and terrorizing in one layered act. 2 years later, that method would reappear over Warsaw and Rotterdam, then in the night raids over London, and later in the firestorms that swallowed parts of Hamburg and Dresden. Guernica announced a new shape of war, a sky of machines deciding the fate of streets and homes. In Paris, Pablo Picasso was already under contract to paint a mural for Spain's pavilion at the 1937 World's Fair. News of the bombing reached him through newspapers and photographs. He scrapped earlier sketches and started anew. On a canvas more than 25 feet wide, he laid out a scene of civilians in extremis: a mother lifting a dead child, a bull that looks on, a horse screaming, a figure trapped under a beam, another reaching toward a light. He chose only black, white, and gray, the palette of newsprint and ash. He worked at speed. The painting, Guernica, debuted weeks later and stunned crowds with its scale and its refusal to flatter any side. It was not a map of the raid. The piece made a plain claim: this is what modern bombing does to people who cannot fight back. Back in Spain, the war turned against the Republic. Bilbao fell weeks after the attack, and by 1939, Franco had consolidated control over the country. Public discussion narrowed to state lines, denials, evasions, and a story that shifted blame. But memory survived in private. Survivors told their children where they had hidden, which alley had been safe until it wasn't, which neighbor had opened a door. Priests kept ledgers of names. The oak outside the Casa de Juntas, damaged but alive, remained a witness to the day the sky came down. After the war, historians and engineers pieced the raid together. They catalogued aircraft and loads, plotted flight times, and estimated the tonnage, roughly 30 tons of mixed explosive and incendiary munitions. They noted the bitter irony that the Renteria Bridge, a legitimate military target, survived, while most of the surrounding neighborhoods were reduced to cinders. The findings hardened what the witnesses had already said. This was a deliberate strike on a civilian center meant to smash morale and block movement at once. Picasso refused to allow Guernica to return to Spain while the dictatorship stood. The canvas crossed the Atlantic and hung for decades at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where veterans, refugees, and students gathered under it during new wars to measure the gap between headlines and human cost. After Franco's death and Spain's shift to democracy, the painting came home in 1981. Today it hangs in Madrid, the surface crazed with age, still doing the work it was made to do. Walk Guernica now and you find a rebuilt town, new streets, a clean plaza, plaques that mark where buildings fell. The oak is protected, the Casa de Juntas open, and the bridge still spans the river. In archives, you can read Steer's dispatch beside official rebuttals that no longer convince. In photographs, the wrecked streets could be any of many later cities. That recognition is the lasting echo of April 1937. The line from this market town to the wider world where civilian centers became targets as a matter of policy. The day began with a routine market and ended with families counting the missing by firelight and smoke. The planes were gone by dusk, but the sound they left behind carries forward whenever sirens rise and people look up. Guernica is a town, a date, and a painting, and it is a warning that still holds. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.